Have you ever had that moment when you realize your own family doesn't see you at all? I stood in the parking lot of Green Hills Funeral Home, clutching a wilting bouquet of white lilies, watching through the windows as my mother, brother, and grandmother sat in the front row of a nearly empty chapel. The funeral director had just politely but firmly informed me that I wasn't on the approved attendance list for my own grandfather's service. The grandfather who had raised me, who had taught me to drive, who had helped me apply to college, who had whispered his final words to me and me alone. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," the funeral director said, his professional sympathy not quite masking his discomfort. "I understand this is difficult, but we have strict instructions from the family." The family. As if I wasn't part of it. My name is Rebecca Taylor, and this is the story of how I was barred from saying goodbye to the person who mattered most to me, and how a simple cassette tape changed everything. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trouble with family secrets is that they're never truly buried. They linger just beneath the surface, like landmines waiting for an unwary step. In my family, the biggest secret wasn't what my grandfather left behind when he died. It was what happened while he was alive. Growing up in Elmwood, a sleepy Midwestern town where everyone knew everyone else's business, I never questioned why I spent more time with my grandparents than with my actual parents. It just seemed normal. That Grandpa Henry and Grandma Margaret were the ones who attended my school plays, supervised my homework, and tucked me in most nights. My mother, Carol, worked long hours at the regional hospital as a nurse administrator, often pulling double shifts or traveling to conferences. My older brother, Michael, was gone before I had conscious memories of him living at home, first to college, then to Chicago for a banking career. "Your mom has important responsibilities," Grandpa Henry would explain when I'd ask why other kids' mothers picked them up from school. "She's helping people get better. That matters a lot." I believed him, of course. When you're 8, 9, 10 years old, you trust the adults around you to tell you the truth about how the world works. It wasn't until much later that I understood the complexity hidden behind his simple explanation, that my mother wasn't just absent because of work, but because of choice. That the distance between us wasn't circumstantial but deliberate. Grandpa Henry filled the spaces my mother left empty. He was a retired high school English teacher who believed in the power of stories to shape character. Our house overflowed with books, classics and contemporary fiction, poetry collections, historical biographies, science texts. Every night before bed, no matter how tired he was, he would read to me. "Books are portals, Becca," he'd say, his voice taking on the reverent quality it always had when discussing literature. "They let you slip into other lives, other times, other ways of seeing. The more you read, the more fully human you become." By the time I was 12, I'd read more books than most adults I knew. I'd traveled to Narnia and Middle-earth, walked the Mississippi with Huck Finn, and explored the moors with Jane Eyre. When other kids complained about required reading at school, I secretly wondered what was wrong with them. Reading wasn't homework to me, it was breathing. Our house on Maple Street was technically my mother's childhood home, but she rarely spent time there despite living just 20 minutes away in a sleek downtown apartment. The arrangement was ostensibly practical. After my father left when I was 3, another family story shrouded in vague explanations, my mother claimed she couldn't afford a place large enough for us both on her salary. Grandpa and Grandma had the space and time to care for me, so that became the solution. "It's temporary," my mother would say during her Sunday visits, which arrived with the regularity and warmth of a tax auditor. "Just until things settle down. At work." That temporary arrangement lasted 15 years. Michael visited even less frequently than my mother. Twice a year at most. Christmas and sometimes Thanksgiving if his girlfriend's family wasn't demanding his presence instead. He'd arrive with expensive gifts and stories about his important clients, barely asking about my life before turning the conversation back to his accomplishments. "How's school, Squirt?" he'd ask, already glancing at his phone. "It's fine," I'd answer, knowing from experience that anything more detailed would cause his eyes to glaze over. Great. Did I tell you about the merger I just helped finance? $40 million deal." And so it would go. The pretense of interest quickly abandoned for self-congratulation. I didn't begrudge him his success. I just wished. It didn't seem to require forgetting where he came from, who had helped him get there. Because Grandpa Henry had helped him too. Had paid for his college applications when our mother claimed they couldn't afford more than 2. Had driven him to campus visits. Had edited his scholarship essays. The difference was that Michael had moved on once the practical assistance was no longer needed, while I had recognized something more valuable in Grandpa's presence. Wisdom, unconditional support, a model for how to move through the world with integrity. "Some people measure success by account balances," Grandpa told me once after Michael departed early from a holiday dinner to take a crucial work call. "Others measure it by the depth of their connections. Both have their rewards, but only one brings real satisfaction." Grandma Margaret was different from Grandpa, more practical, less philosophical, but no less loving. She taught me to cook and so insisted I learn how to balance a checkbook even in this digital age, and demonstrated daily what quiet strength looked like. When Grandpa would get carried away with literary discussions at dinner, she'd wink at me and say, "Men talk, women do, Becca, remember that." They were a perfect balance, my grandparents. His head in books, hers firmly planted in reality. Together they created the stable, loving home my mother seemed uninterested in providing. I was 16 when things began to shift. Grandma Margaret, who had always been the picture of health, started experiencing unexplained pain in her abdomen. At first, she dismissed it as nothing, just age catching up with me. But when it persisted for weeks, Grandpa insisted she see a doctor. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap on a clear day. Pancreatic cancer, already advanced. The prognosis was measured in months, not years. My mother, with her medical background, immediately took charge of Grandma's treatment plan, arranging consultations with specialists and researching clinical trials. It was the most engaged I'd ever seen her in our family's life, though her focus remained entirely on Grandma, never expanding to include me or even really Grandpa. "Mom's vulnerable right now," she explained when I questioned why she still couldn't find time to attend my debate tournament finals despite being at our house almost daily. "I need to focus on her care. You're old enough to understand that, Rebecca." I did understand priorities. I just couldn't understand why I was never one of hers. Grandma declined rapidly despite the aggressive treatments. Within 4 months of her diagnosis, she was gone. The funeral was large. She'd been active in the community, serving on the library board and volunteering at the food pantry for decades. People I'd never met approached me with stories about her kindness, her efficiency, her no-nonsense approach to helping others. "Your grandmother saved our family," one elderly woman told me, clutching my hand. "When Frank lost his job and we were about to lose the house, she organized everything. Food deliveries, bill payments, job interviews. Never made us feel like charity cases either. Said it was just neighbors being neighbors." I collected these stories like precious stones, each one revealing another facet of the woman who had helped raise me. It occurred to me that day that we never fully know the people we love, that they exist in contexts beyond our witnessing, touching lives in ways we may never discover. After Grandma died, my mother's visits became even less frequent. I told myself she was grieving, that her absence was about pain rather than disinterest. But as weeks stretched into months with barely a phone call, the pretense became harder to maintain. Grandpa and I developed new routines in Grandma's absence. He learned to cook simple meals, with many initial disasters that we laughed about later, and I took over the laundry and grocery shopping. We became even closer. our quiet evenings filled with books and conversations that ranged from current events to philosophical questions about existence and purpose. When I was accepted to several colleges my senior year of high school, including Northwestern with a partial scholarship, Grandpa was the one who helped me compare programs and financial aid packages. My mother offered a distracted congratulations when I called to tell her the news, then quickly changed the subject to a difficult patient she was dealing with. "She's proud of you," Grandpa assured me afterward, seeing my disappointment. "She just doesn't know how to show it." "Why not?" I asked, the question that had lingered unspoken for years finally finding voice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What's wrong with me that makes it so hard for her to care? Grandpa's face crumpled with such sadness that I immediately regretted asking. "Oh, Becca, nothing is wrong with you. Nothing at all. The distance your mother keeps, it's about her, not you. Some people aren't capable of the kind of closeness others need. It's like color blindness. They simply can't see certain shades that are vivid to everyone else." "But she's close to Michael," I pointed out. "She calls him weekly, visits him in Chicago, posts about his accomplishments on Facebook constantly." Grandpa sighed, removing his reading glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time when confronted with a difficult truth. "Your brother represents something to your mother that you don't," he said carefully. "Success in conventional terms. Achievement she can quantify and display to others. Your gifts, your empathy, your insight, your loyalty, those are qualities she doesn't value as highly because they can't be measured or showcased." "That's a diplomatic way of saying she loves him more," I said, surprising myself with the bitterness in my voice. "No," Grandpa replied firmly. "It's a diplomatic way of saying she sees him more clearly because what he offers aligns with what she's looking for. But seeing isn't the same as loving, Becca. And not being seen doesn't mean you're not worthy of love. It just means the person looking isn't using the right lens." His words helped, though they couldn't completely heal the wound of my mother's indifference. I chose Northwestern and moved into the dorms that fall, determined to forge my own path. Grandpa and I spoke daily, first by phone, then through video calls once I showed him how to use the iPad I bought him for Christmas. "Technology is marvelous," he'd exclaim each time his face appeared on my screen. Though I still prefer the technology of pen and paper for most communications. They never buffer or require updates. College expanded my world in ways I'd always hoped. I declared a double, major in English literature and psychology, fascinated by the intersection of stories and the human mind. I made friends who shared my interests, joined the literary magazine staff, and even started dating. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as I discovered that Grandpa's assurances about my worth were reflected in how others responded to me. I came home most weekends that first year, unwilling to leave Grandpa alone for too long. He insisted he was fine. Solitude and I are old friends, Becca. But I noticed subtle changes that concerned me. He moved more slowly, forgot small details he would have previously recalled with ease, left tasks half-finished around the house. During spring break of my sophomore year, I arrived home to find him sitting in his armchair, staring at an open book he wasn't reading, a forgotten cup of tea gone cold beside him. "Grandpa," I said, touching his shoulder gently. "Everything okay?" He looked up, momentarily confused, then his face brightened with recognition. "Becca, is it Friday already? I lost track." "It's Monday," I said, alarm bells ringing in my mind. "Start of spring break, remember? We talked about it yesterday." "Of course," he said, but I could see he didn't remember. "Spring break. How wonderful to have you home." I called my mother that evening, genuinely scared. "Something's wrong with Grandpa," I told her. "He's confused, forgetful. He didn't even remember I was coming home today. He's 82, Rebecca, she replied, her tone suggesting I was overreacting. Forgetfulness is normal at his age. This isn't just misplacing his keys, I insisted. He didn't know what day it was, didn't remember our conversation from yesterday. That's not normal aging, Mom. That's something we need to get checked out. Perhaps hearing the unusual assertiveness in my voice, she finally agreed to schedule an appointment with a neurologist. The initial tests led to more tests, which eventually confirmed what I had feared: early-stage Alzheimer's disease. We caught it relatively early, the doctor explained during our family meeting, which consisted of just me, Grandpa, and my mother. Michael was too busy to attend even this critical appointment. There are medications that can help slow progression and lifestyle modifications that can maximize quality of life. My mother took notes with professional detachment, asking clinical questions about treatment options and prognosis. I held Grandpa's hand, watching his face as he absorbed the news that his mind, his greatest treasure, would gradually betray him. "Well," he said finally, with characteristic understatement, "this is quite the plot twist. I changed my college plans immediately, transferring to the state university 40 minutes from home so I could live with Grandpa and care for him." My mother protested, calling it an overreaction. "Northwestern is an excellent school, Rebecca. You're throwing away opportunities for no reason. We can hire a caregiver." "A stranger isn't going to notice when he needs help, but is too proud to ask," I argued. "A stranger won't know that he takes his coffee with exactly 1 teaspoon of sugar, or that he needs his reading glasses cleaned daily because he always forgets. A stranger won't understand why it matters that he still gets to read every night, even if he forgets the plot between sessions." "So you're going to sacrifice your future to be his nursemaid?" she asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. "I'm going to be there for him the way he's always been there for me," I replied. "The way family is supposed to be there for each other." The implied criticism hit its mark. Her face hardened, and she changed tactics. "Fine, but I'm still his medical power of attorney. Major decisions about his care remain my responsibility." That was the beginning of what would become a 3-year battle, not just against Grandpa's progressing disease, but against my mother's distant management of his care and my brother's complete abdication of responsibility. The first year wasn't so bad. Grandpa's decline was gradual, his lucid days still far outnumbering his confused ones. We established routines that helped maintain his independence while providing necessary support. I learned to recognize the signs of an approaching bad day and how to navigate them with minimal distress for both of us. My mother visited monthly, arriving with printouts of research articles and lists of questions for the doctor, but showing little interest in Grandpa's daily life or emotional well-being. Michael came at Christmas, staying less than 48 hours before flying off to a ski vacation with his now-fiancé's family. "You're a saint," he told me as he left, pressing a check into my hand. "This should help with expenses. Let me know if you need more." I wanted to throw the money back at him, to tell him Grandpa needed his presence more than his financial support, but I knew the expenses were real and growing. My part-time job at the university library barely covered groceries, let alone the mounting medical costs that insurance only partially addressed. By the second year, Grandpa's decline accelerated. He began having trouble recognizing even familiar faces, though he always knew me. "My Becca," he would say with certainty, even on days when he couldn't recall what year it was or where he lived. Some essential connection between us remained intact, transcending the disease's erasure of other memories. One lucid afternoon, about 2 years after his diagnosis, he called me into his study where he sat surrounded by books he could no longer easily read. "Becca," he said, his voice stronger and clearer than it had been in weeks. "I need you to help me with something important." "Anything," I promised, sitting beside him. "In my desk drawer, there's a small cassette recorder. Old technology, I know, but reliable." I want to make a recording, a message for after I'm gone. My heart contracted painfully at his matter-of-fact reference to his death, but I nodded and found the recorder, a relic from his teaching days when he would tape lectures for students who missed class. "What kind of message?" I asked, checking that it still worked. "The kind that tells the truth," he replied, a flash of his old determination lighting his eyes. "About what matters, about who showed up, about what I want to happen with the house, and my savings." I hesitated. "Grandpa, Mom has your will and power of attorney. Wouldn't it be better to talk to her about changes you want to make?" He shook his head firmly. "Your mother sees what she wants to see, Becca. Always has. This recording isn't to change legal documents. It's to explain why those documents should be respected even when they don't align with what she expects." Over the next hour, with a clarity that seemed almost miraculous given his recent confusion, Grandpa dictated his message. He spoke about his love for me, his appreciation for my care, and his decision, made long before his diagnosis, to leave the house and the majority of his modest savings to me, rather than dividing everything equally between me and Michael, or leaving it all to my mother, as she had always assumed he would. "Carol will be angry," he acknowledged, naming my mother. "She's always taken for granted that my estate, such as it is, would come to her. But I've watched for years as she's prioritized her career and Michael's accomplishments over your needs. And mine. I've seen who shows up when it matters. That should count for something." He paused the recording, looking at me intently. "This isn't about punishing them, Becca. It's about recognizing you. About acknowledging that family isn't just blood, it's presence, consistency. Care when it's difficult, not just when it's convenient." When he finished recording, he labeled the cassette, "For Rebecca, open after my death," and placed it in an envelope which he sealed. "Keep this somewhere safe," he instructed. "There may come a time when you need to hear these words again, and others may need to hear them for the first time." I tucked the envelope into my desk drawer, not realizing then how prophetic his words would prove to be. The third year of Grandpa's illness brought rapid decline. He began wandering at night, became easily agitated, and struggled with basic self-care. I hired part-time help using the money Michael sent and what I could scrape together from my job, but the burden of his care fell primarily on me. My mother's monthly visits continued with mechanical regularity, but she spent most of her time reviewing medical charts and speaking to doctors rather than actually interacting with Grandpa. When I tried to explain that he responded better to familiar stories and gentle touch than to clinical questions, she dismissed my insights. "I've been a medical professional for 30 years, Rebecca. I think I understand patient care." "He's not just a patient, Mom. He's your father." Her expression would tighten at such reminders, and she would change the subject to something pragmatic, medication schedules or insurance paperwork. In the final month of Grandpa's life, as his systems began shutting down one by one, my mother finally acknowledged what the doctors had been suggesting for weeks. It was time for hospice care. "We'll move him to the palliative care unit at the hospital," she decided. "They're better equipped to manage end-of-life symptoms." "No," I said firmly. "He stays home. That's what he wants." "You can't possibly provide the level of care he needs now," she argued. "I can with hospice support," I countered. "He deserves to die in his own home, surrounded by his books and his memories, not in a sterile hospital room." To my surprise, she relented, perhaps recognizing the determination in my voice that mirrored her father's. Hospice began the next day, bringing the equipment and medication needed to keep Grandpa comfortable during his final decline. The hospice nurses were angels disguised as humans, teaching me how to administer morphine for pain, how to recognize the signs of imminent death, how to provide comfort when words no longer reached him. They spoke to Grandpa with dignity even when he couldn't respond, and treated me with a kindness I had almost forgotten existed outside the walls of our home. "You're doing something sacred," one nurse told me. Being with someone through their final journey is a privilege few people fully understand. I slept on a cot beside Grandpa's bed during those final weeks, alert to every change in his breathing, every whispered word. Most of what he said was nonsensical by then. Fragments of old lectures, lines from favorite poems, conversations with Grandma Margaret, who had been gone for years. My mother visited more frequently as the end approached, but still maintained her emotional distance. She would check his vitals, adjust his medication, and leave without sitting with him for more than a few minutes. Michael called once, asking if he needed to come now or could wait, as if his grandfather's death should be scheduled around his convenience. "Do whatever you want," I told him, too exhausted for politeness. "He probably won't know you're here. Anyway." He decided to wait, promising to come for the funeral instead. On the final night, something remarkable happened. After days of unresponsiveness, Grandpa suddenly opened his eyes and looked directly at me with perfect lucidity. "Becca," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "You remember the tape?" "I remember," I assured him, amazed that he did too. "Listen to it alone first," he instructed. "Then share it when it's needed. Promise me?" "I promise, Grandpa." He nodded, satisfied. "You were the best part of my life, Becca. The very best part." Those were his last coherent words. He slipped into unconsciousness shortly after, his breathing becoming increasingly labored until, just before dawn, it stopped altogether. I sat with him for a long time afterward, holding his hand as it cooled, thanking him silently for everything he had given me. A home, an education, a model for how to live with integrity, and most of all, the gift of being truly seen for exactly who I was. When I finally called my mother, her first response was, "I'll contact the funeral home. We already have arrangements in place." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "How are you holding up?" Just immediate shifting into logistics mode, as if Grandpa's death were a problem to be managed rather than a loss to be grieved. The next 3 days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and paperwork. My mother took charge of everything, consulting me only when absolutely necessary. Michael arrived the day before the funeral, staying at a hotel downtown rather than at the house. "It's easier this way," he explained when I questioned his choice. "Plus, the hotel has better Wi-Fi for work calls." The night before the funeral, I remembered Grandpa's recording. Alone in the house for the first time since his death, I retrieved the envelope from my desk drawer and carefully removed the cassette. Finding the old player took some searching, but eventually I located it in his study drawer. With trembling fingers, I inserted the tape and pressed play. "Becca!" Grandpa's voice filled the room, strong and clear as it had been before his illness. A voice from the past speaking directly into my present grief. "If you're listening to this, I'm gone, and you're keeping your promise to check the recording." I smiled through my tears at his certainty that I would remember. "I've made some decisions that may cause conflict in the family," he continued. "As you know, I've left the house and the majority of my savings to you rather than to your mother or divided equally with Michael. This isn't a decision I made lightly or without careful consideration of family dynamics." He paused, and I could almost see him adjusting his glasses, gathering his thoughts as he always did before addressing something important. "For the past 20 years, you have been the heart of this family, Becca. When your grandmother died, when my health began to fail, when difficult decisions needed to be made, you were the one who showed up consistently, who prioritized connection over convenience, who demonstrated what family truly means." His voice grew firmer, more resolved. "Your mother and brother will likely be angry when they learn of my decisions. They may accuse you of manipulation or taking advantage of my illness. That's why I'm making this recording while I'm still clear-minded enough to explain my reasoning." What followed was a detailed account of the care I had provided, contrasted with my mother's distant management and Michael's almost complete absence. He cited specific examples, Dates, times, instances when they had chosen other priorities over his needs or mine. His tone wasn't bitter or accusatory, just matter of fact, as if documenting an objective reality that might later be disputed. "This isn't about punishment," he emphasized, echoing what he'd told me when making the recording. "It's about recognition, about acknowledging that family is defined by actions, not just blood. Becca has earned this inheritance through years of sacrifice and genuine love. The others have not." As the recording continued, I realized this wasn't just a message for me. It was a testimony, evidence I might need when facing the inevitable challenges from my mother and brother. Grandpa had anticipated exactly how they would react and had prepared me with his voice from beyond death. "Keep this recording safe," he concluded. "Share it if necessary, when my wishes are questioned or your character is attacked. And remember, Becca, you were seen. Your sacrifices were witnessed. Your love was recognized and returned. No one can take that away, regardless of what happens next." The tape clicked off, leaving me sitting in the silent room, tears streaming down my face. Not just tears of grief, but of validation, of having my experience acknowledged by the person whose opinion mattered most to me. I carefully rewound the tape and returned it to its envelope, then placed it in my purse where it would remain safe and accessible. Something told me I would need it sooner rather than later. The next morning, I arrived at Green Hill's funeral, home an hour early, wanting to have some quiet time with Grandpa before the service began. To my surprise, the funeral director met me at the door with an uncomfortable expression. "Ms. Taylor," he said formally, "I need to speak with you privately before you go in." He led me to a small office and closed the door before continuing. "I'm afraid there's been a miscommunication about today's service. Your mother has requested a private, family-only ceremony. She provided a specific attendance list, and I regret to inform you that your name is not on it." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "That's impossible. I'm his granddaughter. I lived with him. I cared for him through his entire illness." "I understand," he said, his discomfort evident. "However, as next of kin and executor of the estate, Ms. Carol Taylor has final authority over funeral arrangements. She was quite explicit that you should not be admitted to the service." The room seemed to tilt around me as I processed his words. My own mother had intentionally excluded me from Grandpa's funeral, the final, unimaginable cruelty in a lifetime of smaller rejections. "There must be some mistake," I insisted, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Please, just call." "Her! Let me speak to her." "She anticipated your reaction," he said apologetically, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk. "She asked me to give you this if you arrived." With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and read the brief note. Inside, "Rebecca, your emotional state is concerning to all of us. Your attachment to Dad has always been excessive and unhealthy. The funeral needs to be a dignified affair, not a platform for your dramatic displays of grief. Please respect our wishes and allow us to say goodbye appropriately. Mom." The clinical coldness of her words, the complete dismissal of my relationship with Grandpa, the characterization of my grief as excessive, it was so breathtakingly cruel that for a moment I couldn't respond. "I'm truly sorry," the funeral director said, seeming to mean it. "In 30 years in this profession, I've never had to enforce something like this." I stood slowly, gathering what dignity I could find. "May I at least leave these for him?" I asked, holding out the lilies I had brought, his favorite flowers, the ones that had grown along the fence in our backyard. "Of course," he said, taking them gently. "I'll place them with him personally." I nodded beyond words and walked out into the bright morning sunshine that seemed to mock my darkness. Through the chapel windows, I could see my mother, Michael, and Grandma Margaret's sister, the entire approved attendance list, for a man who had touched countless lives, whose funeral should have filled the largest church in town. Standing there in the parking lot, clutching my purse with Grandpa's recording safely inside, I made a decision. This wasn't over. The funeral might proceed without me today, but the truth about our family, about who had truly been there for Grandpa, about his actual wishes would not remain buried. Grandpa had prepared me for this moment, had armed me with his own voice speaking truth from beyond death. I wouldn't use it rashly or in anger, but when the time came, when they inevitably challenged his will and accused me of manipulation, they would hear what he really thought, what he really wanted, who he had really seen. I walked back to my car, a strange calm replacing my initial shock. I would grieve Grandpa in my own way, honor him through living the values he had taught me. And when the battle over his estate inevitably began, I would be ready. Because some voices deserve to be heard, even when others try to silence them, especially then. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, fingering the cassette tape in my pocket and remembering Grandpa's words. No ceremony, no polished granite headstone, no carefully curated guest list can define what we meant to each other. He had known this might happen, had prepared me for it, but the reality still cut deeper than I could have imagined. With sudden resolve, I grabbed my purse and car keys. I might not be welcome at the official service, but I couldn't stay away entirely. I would go to the funeral home and wait outside. If necessary, I needed to be as close as I could, even if only in the parking lot. The drive to Green Hills Funeral Home took 15 minutes that felt like hours. My thoughts raced between disbelief that this was actually happening and fury at my mother and brother for their cruelty. What kind of people exclude someone from their grandfather's funeral? What kind of twisted thinking made that seem reasonable? As I pulled into the parking lot, my heart sank. I had expected to see dozens of cars. Grandpa Joe had been beloved in the community, respected by colleagues, cherished by former students. Instead, there were only 5 vehicles: my mother's SUV, Tom's luxury sedan, Grandma Beth's old Buick, driven by a neighbor since she no longer drove, the funeral director's car, and one I didn't recognize. They hadn't limited the service to immediate family. They had simply excluded me. I parked at the far end of the lot and sat watching the chapel entrance, tears streaming down my face. This small, sparsely attended ceremony couldn't possibly capture the richness of Grandpa Joe's life, the depth of his impact, the breadth of his connections. It was a pale imitation of what should have been, what would have been if I'd been allowed to help plan it. After a few minutes, I noticed Tom step outside, checking his phone. When he looked up and spotted my car, his expression hardened. He walked purposefully toward me, and I briefly considered driving away to avoid the confrontation. But something in me refused to be chased off. Not today, not from this. I stepped out of my car as he approached, his face flushed with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "We were very clear about this, Sarah." I struggled to keep my voice steady. "I'm saying goodbye to my grandfather, Tom. I'm not causing a scene. I'm not disrupting anything. I'm simply sitting in my car in a public parking lot." "This isn't helping anyone," he said dismissively. "Mom's already upset enough without having to worry about you making a grand entrance." "Is that really what you think of me?" I asked, genuinely curious about how his perception could be so warped. That I'd disrupt Grandpa's funeral for attention? "It's not about what I think," he replied, glancing back at the chapel. "It's about respecting Mom's wishes on an already difficult day." "What about respecting Grandpa's wishes?" I countered. "He wanted cremation, not burial. He wanted his favorite poems read, not religious hymns. He wanted all of his family present, including me." Tom's expression became patronizing. "You always think you knew what Dad wanted better than anyone else." "It's exhausting, Sarah. Not everything was about your special relationship with him. "This isn't about me being special," I said, my frustration mounting. "This is about honoring who he actually was, not some sanitized version that makes Mom comfortable." "That's exactly the kind of dramatic statement that proves our point," he said with a dismissive wave. "Look, the service is about to start. Either leave now, or I'll have to ask the funeral director to intervene." The threat shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I stared at my brother, this person who shared my blood, my early memories, my grandparents, and realized I didn't know him at all. Perhaps I never had. "Fine," I said quietly. "I'll leave. But know this, Tom. What you and Mom are doing today isn't protecting Grandma or honoring Grandpa. It's serving yourselves. And someday, when you're finally honest with yourself, you'll regret it." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply watching as I got back into my car. I drove away with my vision blurred by tears, pulling over a few blocks later when it became too dangerous to continue. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, alternating between waves of grief and flashes of anger so intense they left me breathless. When my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, "Where are you? I just got to the funeral home and they said you weren't invited. What's happening?" I realized I'd forgotten to warn her about the situation. "They banned me from the funeral," I texted back. "Long story. Don't make a scene for Grandma's sake. Call me after." By the time I returned to my grandparents' house, I felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been scraped from inside me. The house was quiet, empty while everyone was at the burial I wasn't permitted to attend. I wandered from room to room, touching Grandpa Joe's belongings, his reading glasses on the side table, his cardigan hanging on the back of his study chair, his favorite coffee mug in the dish drainer. Each item another piece of the man I'd lost, another tangible connection soon to be packed away. When I entered his study, I was drawn again to his desk. If he'd left one recording for me, could there be others? I began opening drawers, not sure what I was looking for, but driven by an instinct that there was more to find. In the top right drawer, beneath a stack of letterhead, I discovered a sealed envelope with "To be opened after my death, Joseph Wilson," written on the front. Inside was a letter from Grandpa to his attorney, dated just 3 months earlier, explicitly outlining his funeral wishes, including that I should be involved in all arrangements and decisions. "My granddaughter, Sarah Miller, has been my primary caregiver and closest family member," he had written. "She knows my wishes better than anyone and should be consulted on all matters related to my funeral and burial." The letter continued, specifying his desire for cremation, for a celebration of life rather than a religious service, for his ashes to be scattered in Jefferson National Forest where he had hiked for decades. Everything I had tried to tell my mother, everything she had dismissed. I sank into his chair, clutching the letter. Here was proof that I hadn't been making things up, that I really did know what he wanted, but it had come too late to change today's events. I was still sitting there when I heard the front door open and voices enter the foyer. The funeral party had returned. I quickly tucked the letter into my pocket and went to greet them, determined to be present for Grandma Beth despite my exclusion from the service. My mother looked surprised to see me there. "I thought you'd left," she said stiffly. "I went for a drive to clear my head," I replied, focusing on Grandma Beth, who looked exhausted and frail. "Let me help you to the couch, Grandma." As I guided her to the living room, neighbors and the few family members who had attended the service began arriving with food and condolences. The house gradually filled with quiet conversations and the subtle choreography of grief. Dishes being arranged, coffee brewed, chairs pulled into intimate groupings. I moved through it all like a ghost, helping where needed but feeling fundamentally disconnected from this gathering that was supposed to honor a man I had loved deeply, yet somehow excluded the fullness of who he had been. Lisa arrived and immediately sought me out, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What happened?" she whispered, pulling me into the kitchen on the pretense of getting more coffee. They wouldn't let me speak to you beforehand, and the service was so generic. It didn't sound anything like Uncle Joe. They decided I was too emotional to attend, I explained quietly, the absurdity of it still fresh. Apparently, genuine grief is embarrassing. Lisa shook her head, outraged on my behalf. That's insane. You were closer to him than anyone. Not according to them, I said, nodding toward my mother, who was accepting condolences with practiced grace. According to them, I exaggerated our relationship for attention. That's the most backwards thing I've ever heard, Lisa said fiercely. Everyone knew how close you were. He talked about you constantly. Her validation soothed something, raw inside me. At least someone else had seen it, had witnessed the bond that my mother and brother seemed determined to erase. The afternoon crept by in a haze of small talk and platitudes. I overheard my mother tell someone that Grandpa had always wanted to be buried next to his parents, a complete fabrication. I watched Tom accept compliments on the beautiful service he had helped plan, a service that would have made Grandpa uncomfortable in every way. By evening, only immediate family remained: my mother, Tom, Grandma Beth, and me. Lisa had reluctantly left to drive back to Portland, extracting a promise that I would call her the next day. We sat in the living room, the weight of the day pressing down on us. Grandma Beth had barely spoken, lost in her grief. My mother was reviewing a list of people to thank for flowers and food. Tom was scrolling through his phone, already mentally checked out. Mr. Reeves called, my mother said suddenly, looking up from her list. He wants us to meet tomorrow at 10 for the reading of Dad's will. Tom's attention snapped back to the room. Did he give any indication of what to expect? The eagerness in his voice made my stomach turn. We were barely hours past Grandpa's funeral, and he was already calculating his inheritance. None, my mother replied. Just that all beneficiaries should be present. Her eyes flicked to me briefly, as if wondering whether I qualified as a beneficiary worth including. After today's exclusion, I wouldn't have been surprised if they had planned to keep the will reading from me too. I'll be there, I said firmly, making eye contact with my mother, daring her to object. She nodded stiffly. Fine. 10 o'clock at his office downtown. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a simple black dress and minimal makeup, determined to maintain my composure no matter what the will contained. I had Grandpa's recording and the letter from his desk safely in my purse, though I wasn't yet sure how or if I would use them. When I arrived at Mr. Reeves's office, my mother and Tom were already there, sitting stiffly in the reception area. They barely acknowledged my arrival. Grandma Beth came in a few minutes later, accompanied by her sister who had driven up from Virginia for the funeral. Mr. Reeves, a dignified man in his 60s, who had been my grandfather's attorney for decades, greeted us with appropriate solemnity and ushered us into a conference room. We arranged ourselves around the polished table, Grandma Beth and her sister on one side, my mother and Tom on the other, and me at the far end, physically separated, just as I had been emotionally. Before we begin, Mr. Reeves said, opening a leather portfolio, I want to express my personal condolences. Joe Wilson was not just a client, but a friend for over 30 years. His loss is felt deeply by many. My mother nodded graciously, as if accepting condolences on behalf of all of us. Tom glanced impatiently at his watch. Now, to the matter at hand, Mr. Reeves continued. This is the last will and testament of Joseph Andrew Wilson, dated June 15th of this year. June, my mother interrupted, her brow furrowing. Dad amended his will recently? Yes, Mr. Reeves confirmed. The previous version was from 2019, but he made significant changes 3 months ago. Tom and my mother exchanged uneasy glances. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart had begun to race. This was what Grandpa had been doing in his study during those private hours, not just recording messages, but legally ensuring his wishes would be carried out. Mr. Reeves began reading the formal introduction to the will, the standard language, establishing that my grandfather had been of sound mind and body when making his decisions. Then he moved to the specific bequests. To my beloved wife, Elizabeth Ann Wilson, I leave our joint savings and investments, already held in both our names, to use for her comfort and care for the remainder of her life. Grandma Beth nodded slightly, unsurprised. Their finances had always been transparent and shared. To my daughter, Nancy Wilson Miller, I leave the sum of $50,000. My mother's sharp intake of breath was audible across the table. 50,000? That's all? Mr. Reeves paused, glancing up at her but offering no commentary before continuing. To my grandson, Thomas Miller, I leave the sum of $25,000, with the suggestion that it be used toward the education of any future children he may have. Tom's face flushed dark red. 25,000? After everything I've done for him? I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from asking exactly what he believed he had done for Grandpa Joe, beyond occasionally showing up for free meals and financial advice. To my cousin Martin's daughter, Lisa Chen, who showed remarkable kindness in my final months, I leave my collection of first edition literature books and the sum of $15,000. This was a surprise to me. I hadn't known Grandpa, had included Lisa in his will. Her kindness had clearly made a deeper impression than I realized. And to my granddaughter, Sarah Miller, my mother interrupted again. Is this all really necessary to read aloud? Couldn't we just each have a copy to review privately? Mr. Reeves regarded her steadily. Your father specifically requested that his will be read aloud with all beneficiaries present, Mrs. Miller. He was quite insistent on this point. My mother subsided, her lips pressed into a thin line. To my granddaughter, Sarah Miller, Mr. Reeves continued, who has been more daughter than granddaughter to me, I leave our family home at 1742 Oakwood Drive to be hers entirely upon the death of my wife, Elizabeth, or sooner should Elizabeth choose to relocate. Until such time, Sarah shall be joint owner with Elizabeth, responsible for maintenance and taxes, with Elizabeth retaining the right of residence. The room went completely silent. I stared at Mr. Reeves, certain I had misheard. The house, the beautiful Victorian where I had spent so much of my childhood, where I had effectively been raised, was to be mine? Additionally, to Sarah Miller, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all personal possessions not specifically bequeathed above, my retirement accounts, and the proceeds from my life insurance policy, amounting to approximately $375,000. This is outrageous! My mother burst out, unable to contain herself any longer. There's been some mistake. Dad would never cut me out like this in favor of Sarah. Mr. Reeves remained impassive. There is no mistake, Mrs. Miller. Your father was explicit about his wishes and took extra precautions to ensure this will could not be successfully contested. He anticipated there might be objections. Of course there are objections, Tom exclaimed. Sarah obviously manipulated him when he was vulnerable and sick. This is elder abuse, plain and simple. I flinched at the accusation, though I had been expecting something like it based on Grandpa's warning. Tom, Grandma Beth said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the room. Stop it. This is what Joe wanted. You knew about this? My mother asked incredulously, turning to her mother. Of course I knew, Grandma replied with unexpected firmness. We discussed all our financial decisions together, always. Joe was very clear about wanting to acknowledge the care and attention Sarah provided, especially in his final years. We all helped, my mother insisted. I gave medical advice constantly. Tom checked in regularly. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. I couldn't stay silent any longer. "No, you didn't," I said, my voice low but clear. "You visited when it was convenient. You called occasionally. You did the absolute minimum while I was there every single day, managing his medications, taking him to appointments, helping Grandma with everything from groceries to insurance paperwork." "Here she goes again, making herself the martyr," Tom said dismissively. Mr. Reeves cleared his throat. "If I may continue, there is an addendum to the will that addresses these very concerns." He turned a page in the portfolio. "I, Joseph Andrew Wilson, anticipate that my decisions regarding the distribution of my estate may cause discord within my family. To address potential accusations that my granddaughter Sarah unduly influenced me, I have documented my reasons extensively, with my physician, Dr. Harold Myers, and in a separate video recording witnessed by both Dr. Myers and Mr. Reeves." The mention of a video recording sent a jolt through me. I had the audio cassette, but I hadn't known about a video. This video details specific instances over the past decade that informed my decision, including dates, times, and circumstances of family visits, assistance provided, and meaningful interactions. I have chosen Sarah as my primary beneficiary, not on a whim or due to manipulation, but because she has demonstrated through consistent actions that she values family bonds over material assets. Mr. Reeves looked up, his expression grave. "The video Mr. Wilson mentions is available for viewing now, if you wish. He was most insistent that it be shown if there were any objections to the will's provisions." My mother and Tom exchanged nervous glances, their earlier confidence faltering. "That won't be necessary," my mother said quickly. "We would need time to consult our own attorney before viewing any such recording." Translation: They needed time to figure out how to challenge the will despite Grandpa's precautions. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded, "I would like to see it." Grandpa left me a message saying there would be something like this, and I'd like to hear his reasons directly from him. Mr. Reeves nodded and pressed a button on his desk phone. "Patricia, could you bring in the television and the Wilson recording, please?" As his assistant set up a small TV and DVD player, the tension in the room thickened to an almost unbearable degree. My mother was whispering furiously to Tom, while Grandma Beth sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The video began with Grandpa Joe sitting in his study, looking tired but clear-eyed. The date stamp showed it had been recorded just 2 months before his death. "My name is Joseph Andrew Wilson," he began, his voice stronger than it had been in his final weeks. "I am recording this statement of my own free will in the presence of my physician, Dr. Harold Myers, and my attorney, Edward Reeves, to explain the decisions I have made regarding my estate." The camera panned briefly to show both men mentioned, establishing their presence as witnesses. "I have chosen to leave the majority of my estate to my granddaughter, Sarah Miller, with provisions for my wife, Elizabeth, my daughter, Nancy, and my grandson, Thomas. This decision was not made lightly or without careful consideration of family dynamics and individual contributions to my well-being." He adjusted his glasses in that familiar way that made my heart ache with missing him. Over the past decade, as I've aged and experienced increasing health challenges, the pattern of who shows up, literally and figuratively, has become unmistakably clear. I have kept a journal documenting family visits, calls, and assistance, which I will reference during this statement. He held up a small black notebook that I recognized as the one he'd kept in his bedside drawer. From January 2020 to the present, my granddaughter Sarah has visited our home approximately 731 times, essentially every other day for 5 years. She has taken me to 97 medical appointments, handled all prescription management, and provided approximately 1,340 hours of direct assistance with daily activities. He turned a page in his notebook. During this same period, my daughter Nancy has visited 62 times, primarily on holidays and occasional weekends. She has taken me to 0 medical appointments and provided approximately 48 hours of direct assistance, mostly in the form of advice rather than hands-on help. My mother's face had gone completely white. My grandson Thomas has visited 37 times. In 5 years, almost exclusively for holiday dinners, or when seeking financial advice for his real estate ventures. He has provided 0 hours of direct assistance. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no longer making eye contact with anyone. I do not share these statistics to shame anyone, but to establish a factual basis for my decisions. Family relationships are not solely about practical assistance, of course. They are also about emotional connection, shared values, and mutual respect. Grandpa paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. In these aspects as well, Sarah has demonstrated a consistent commitment to our relationship. She calls when she says she will call. She remembers important dates without prompting. She asks thoughtful questions about my life experiences and actually listens to the answers. In short, she has shown up in every way that matters, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. I felt tears beginning to well up but blinked them back, determined to maintain my composure. Nancy and Thomas, on the other hand, have increasingly approached our relationship as a transaction. Visits exchanged for future inheritance, attention contingent upon what I can provide materially. This pattern has been particularly evident in discussions about my home, which both have independently suggested I should sign over to them to avoid complications later, despite my wife's and my continued residence there. Grandma Beth nodded slightly at this, confirming she too had witnessed these conversations. I want to be clear, Grandpa continued, his voice growing firmer. I am not punishing Nancy and Thomas with my estate decisions. I am recognizing and rewarding Sarah's genuine care and commitment. There is a profound difference. He looked directly into the camera, and for a moment it felt as if he were in the room with us, his gaze still able to see through pretense to truth. If you are watching this recording, it means my decisions have been questioned or challenged. I expected as much. To Nancy and Thomas, if you are present. I loved you both, but I saw you clearly. To Sarah, stand firm in the knowledge that you earned this inheritance through love, not manipulation. And to Beth, my beloved wife, thank you for supporting my decision to acknowledge the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable for our daughter. The recording ended, and the room fell into a stunned silence. Mr. Reeves turned off the television and regarded us all steadily. As you can see, he said quietly, Mr. Wilson was quite thorough in documenting his reasoning. There is additional footage if needed, including specific examples of interactions he found particularly revealing. My mother stood abruptly, gathering her purse with shaking hands. I need time to process this. Tom, we should go. Tom looked shell-shocked, his earlier belligerence replaced by a kind of dazed disbelief. He followed my mother, mechanically, neither of them speaking directly to me or Grandma Beth as they left. When the door closed behind them, Grandma reached across the table and took my hand in hers. He wanted you to know that you were seen, she said softly. All those times when Nancy dismissed your help or Tom took credit for things you'd done, Joe saw it all. He just didn't know how to fix it while he was alive. I never expected this, I said truthfully. I never helped him for an inheritance. We know that, dear, she assured me, squeezing my hand. That's precisely why he made the decision he did. Mr. Reeves cleared his throat gently. There is one more item your grandfather left specifically for you, Sarah. He asked that I give it to you privately after the will reading. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small box, which he passed across the table to me. Inside was a key I didn't recognize and a note in Grandpa's handwriting. For the cabin. Your sanctuary when you need one. The cabin? I asked, confused. Mr. Reeves smiled for the first time that morning. Your grandfather purchased a small writing cabin in Jefferson National Forest last year. One room, very rustic, but with a remarkable view. He said you had once mentioned wanting a quiet place to write, and he thought this might serve. Fresh tears sprang to my eyes, but these were different. Tears of wonder at being so deeply known, so specifically loved. I hadn't just been seen, I had been understood in ways I hadn't even fully articulated to myself. As Grandma Beth and I drove home, the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days, Grandpa's death, my exclusion from his funeral, the revelations of the will, settled over me like a heavy blanket. There would be battles ahead, no doubt. My mother and Tom would not accept these developments without a fight. But for the first time since Grandpa died, I felt something like peace. Not because of the inheritance itself, but because of what it represented, validation that the connection I'd felt with him had been real, mutual, and valuable. No one could take that away, no matter what legal challenges might come. In the quiet of the car, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the outline of the cassette tape. Grandpa's voice preserved, his wisdom still accessible, his love still present, even in his absence. Some bonds transcend death, I realized. Some relationships leave an imprint so deep that they become part of who we are. I would face whatever came next with that knowledge as my foundation. Grandpa Joe had given me one final gift beyond the material provisions of his will. The unshakable certainty that I had been loved for exactly who I was, not for who someone else wanted me to be. And in a family where acceptance had always felt conditional, that was the greatest inheritance of all. The weeks following the will reading unfolded with a predictable mixture of legal maneuvers and uncomfortable silences. My mother and Tom wasted no time consulting an attorney about contesting the will, citing undue influence, and questioning Grandpa Joe's mental capacity during his final months. Their lawyer sent formal letters demanding access to his medical records, requesting copies of his journals, and insisting on forensic analysis of the video recording Mr. Reeves had shown us. Grandma Beth watched these developments with quiet resignation. Your mother was always stubborn, she told me over tea one morning. Even as a child, she couldn't accept when things didn't go her way. Joe used to say she'd argue with the rain for falling. I had moved temporarily into my grandparents' house, my house now, at least partially, to help Grandma adjust to life without Grandpa. The empty space he'd left seemed to grow rather than diminish with time, expanding into corners where his presence had once been so natural it was almost invisible. The indent in his favorite armchair, the gap in the medicine cabinet where his shaving cream had stood, the silence at 7:30 each morning when he would have announced the weather forecast from the newspaper. Do you think they'll succeed? I asked Grandma, returning to the subject of the will contest. In overturning Grandpa's wishes, I mean. She shook her head, stirring honey into her tea with deliberate precision. No, Joe was too thorough, too careful. He knew exactly what Nancy would do, and he prepared accordingly. Did you and Grandpa talk about this? About leaving the house to me instead of Mom? Of course we did, she replied, looking up with surprise. We talked about everything. We were married for 62 years, Sarah. That doesn't work without communication. And you agreed? You weren't hurt that he changed the plan? Her expression softened. Oh, sweetheart, I suggested it. I was the one who pointed out the pattern of who showed up and who didn't, who respected this home and who saw it as an asset to be claimed. This revelation stunned me. I had assumed Grandpa had made these decisions independently, possibly even keeping them from Grandma to avoid putting her in an uncomfortable position with my mother. Joe was fair to a fault, Grandma continued. gazing out the kitchen window at the garden they had tended together for decades. He would have divided everything equally if fairness were simply about blood relation. But we both came to understand that true fairness isn't about treating everyone identically. It's about recognizing genuine care and commitment. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. This house has always been more yours than Nancy's, even before. You lived here as a child. She couldn't wait to leave it, found it old-fashioned, limiting. But you understood what made it special. You helped paint the porch railings every spring. You asked about the history of the stained glass in the entryway. You noticed when things needed repair or attention. Her words filled a space inside me I hadn't realized was empty. A place that had questioned, despite everything, whether I had somehow manipulated the situation, whether I truly deserved what Grandpa had left me. "Thank you for telling me that," I said quietly. "Truth is important," she replied simply, "especially within family." 2 days later, I received a formal letter from my mother's attorney requesting a meeting to discuss an amicable resolution to the current dispute. Translation: they realized contesting the will would be difficult given Grandpa's precautions, so they were hoping to negotiate a settlement. I called Mr. Reeves immediately. "They want to meet. What should I do?" "Hear them out," he advised. "But remember, you're negotiating from a position of strength. Your grandfather's will is solid, his mental capacity well documented, and his reasoning explicit. You don't need to accept anything that contradicts his clearly expressed wishes." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Mr. Reeves's office. I arrived 15 minutes early, my stomach tight with anxiety despite my legal advantages. This wasn't just about property or money, it was about family relationships already stretched to the breaking point. My mother and Tom arrived with their attorney, a sleek woman in her 40s named Diane Mercer. After brief, uncomfortable introductions, we settled around the conference table, myself and Mr. Reeves on one side, the three of them opposite. Ms. Mercer opened with practiced cordiality. "We appreciate your willingness to discuss this matter directly, Ms. Miller. Family disagreements are always difficult, but I believe we can find a solution that honors Mr. Wilson's legacy while addressing some concerns about the distribution of his estate." Mr. Reeves remained impassive. "We're happy to listen to your proposal." "My clients recognize that Mr. Wilson intended to provide for his granddaughter," Ms. Mercer continued smoothly. "However, they believe the current arrangement creates unnecessary family conflict and fails to honor decades of established expectations." I nearly laughed at the phrase, unnecessary family conflict, as if the conflict stemmed from the will itself rather than from their reaction to it. "What exactly are you proposing?" Mr. Reeves asked. Ms. Mercer slid a document across the table. "We believe a more equitable arrangement would be for the house to be sold upon Mrs. Wilson's death or relocation, with proceeds divided equally between Nancy Miller and Sarah Miller. Additionally, we propose that the remaining liquid assets be divided with 60% going to Nancy Miller as Mr. Wilson's daughter, 25% to Sarah Miller, and 15% to Thomas Miller." I glanced at the figures, then at my mother and brother. They sat stiffly, avoiding direct eye contact, their expressions carefully neutral. "This proposal completely disregards Mr. Wilson's explicit wishes," Mr. Reeves observed mildly. "He was quite specific about his reasons for the distribution he selected." "With all due respect," Ms. Mercer replied, "we believe Mr. Wilson was unduly influenced during a period of vulnerability. A daughter should not be effectively disinherited in favor of a granddaughter, regardless of visitation frequency." Something about her dismissive phrasing, visitation frequency, ignited a slow, burning anger in me. As if the thousands of hours I'd spent caring for Grandpa, managing his medications, driving him to appointments, reading to him when his vision became too poor to read himself, could be reduced to mere visits comparable to my mother's occasional drop-ins. "It wasn't about visitation," I said, speaking for the first time. "It was about care. commitment, showing up consistently, not just when it was convenient. My mother's composure cracked slightly. That's unfair, Sarah. I had a full-time career in a demanding field. I couldn't be there every day, but I contributed in other ways. Like what? I challenged. When was the last time you helped Grandpa with his medications? Or sat with him during chemo? Or even knew what books he was reading? I provided medical expertise, she insisted. I consulted with his doctors. I researched treatment options. From a distance, I pointed out. While I was the one holding the basin when he vomited from those treatments. While I was the one washing his hair when he was too weak to shower. Alone. Tom interjected, his voice tight with indignation. You make it sound like we abandoned him. We were busy with our own lives and responsibilities. Not everyone can drop everything to play nursemaid. The contempt in the word nursemaid sent a wave of cold fury through me. It wasn't playing anything. It was being there for someone I loved during the hardest time of his life. It was showing up. Something you both consistently failed to do. Ms. Mercer cleared her throat. This emotional approach isn't productive. We're trying to reach a reasonable compromise. There's nothing reasonable about ignoring a man's clearly expressed wishes for his own property, I responded, my voice steadier than I felt. Grandpa made his decisions with full awareness of everyone's contributions, or lack thereof. He documented everything precisely because he anticipated this exact situation. Documentation created when he was already ill, Ms. Mercer noted, smoothly. When he was potentially confused or manipulable. Mr. Reeves intervened. Ms. Mercer, your insinuations border on defamatory. Mr. Wilson's physician certified his mental competence multiple times during the period in question, including specifically for legal purposes. The video statement was recorded under controlled conditions with 2 professional witnesses. Any suggestion of manipulation would be extraordinarily difficult to prove in court. A tense silence followed. My mother stared at the table, her fingers worrying the edge of the proposal document. Tom checked his watch, his standard move when uncomfortable. Perhaps, Mr. Reeves continued, we should address what's really at issue here. The house has been in the Wilson family for 3 generations. Mrs. Miller expected to inherit it as the only child. Finding that expectation unmet is understandably jarring. But Mr. Wilson was explicit about his reasoning, which had nothing to do with familial position and everything to do with demonstrated care and commitment. My mother looked up sharply. Are you suggesting I didn't care for my own father? Mr. Reeves met her gaze steadily. I'm suggesting that Mr. Wilson perceived differences in how that care was manifested by different family members, and he made his estate decisions accordingly. This isn't going anywhere, Tom said abruptly, pushing back from the table. They're clearly not interested in compromise. Ms. Mercer placed a restraining hand on his arm. Let's stay focused. What counter-proposal would you consider, Ms. Miller? She asked, addressing me directly. I took a deep breath. Despite everything, these people were still my family. The thought of a prolonged legal battle, of exposing our private conflicts, in court, of forcing Grandma Beth to testify about family dynamics, it all felt deeply wrong. I will honor Grandpa's wishes exactly as he expressed them, I said finally. The house will remain Grandma's home for as long as she wants to live. There. After that, or if she chooses to move earlier, it will be mine as Grandpa intended. My mother's expression hardened. So that's it? No compromise at all? I wasn't finished, I continued. While I won't change the arrangements regarding the house, I'm willing to establish a college fund for any children Tom may have in the future, using a portion of the liquid assets Grandpa left me. Education was important to Grandpa. I think he would approve of that modification. Tom looked surprised. How much of a portion? $50,000, I said, to be held in trust until needed for legitimate educational expenses. Mrs. Mercer leaned toward my mother, whispering something in her ear. My mother frowned, then nodded slightly. "And for Mom?" Tom pressed. "Nothing additional for her?" I studied my mother, this woman who had given me life but never truly seen me, who had consistently prioritized Tom while treating me as an afterthought, who had excluded me from my own grandfather's funeral out of fear that my genuine grief might overshadow her performance of the dutiful daughter. "I'll establish a similar fund for Mom's retirement," I said after a moment. "Another $50,000, invested conservatively, to supplement her existing retirement plans." My mother's eyes widened slightly. She clearly hadn't expected any concession. "That's considerably less than our proposal," Ms. Mercer pointed out. "It is," I agreed, "because I'm not obligated to offer anything. Grandpa's will is legally sound and morally justified. These adjustments are gestures of goodwill, not admissions that his decisions were flawed." Ms. Mercer conferred quietly with my mother and Tom. I could see the calculation in their expressions, weighing the modest offer against the costs and uncertain outcome of a court battle. "We need time to consider this," Ms. Mercer finally said. "My clients will respond within the week." As we prepared to leave, my mother paused at the door. "Why are you doing this, Sarah? Is it just about the money and the house?" The question revealed how little she understood. About me, about Grandpa, about what had actually transpired between us over the years. "It's about respecting Grandpa's wishes," I replied simply. "About acknowledging that he knew exactly what he was doing and why. And yes, it's about recognizing that I was there for him in ways you chose not to be." Her face flushed. "You always were self-righteous," Joe encouraged. "That in you, that sense of moral superiority." "He encouraged honesty," I corrected, keeping my voice level with effort. "Even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then." She left without responding, Tom following close behind. As their footsteps receded down the hallway, I felt a curious mixture of sadness and relief. Something fundamental had shifted between us. Pretenses dropped, polite fictions abandoned. There was pain in that clarity, but also a strange liberation. "You handled that well," Mr. Reeves observed as we gathered our papers. "Your grandfather would have been proud." "Do you think they'll accept?" I asked. He considered this. "Probably. Ms. Mercer is experienced enough to recognize a will contest would be expensive and likely unsuccessful. Your concessions, while modest, provide a face-saving way for them to settle without admitting defeat." He was right. 3 days later, we received formal acceptance of my offer, along with additional conditions about communication and timeline that seemed designed primarily to assert some measure of control. The agreement was signed within a week, the funds transferred to the specified trusts. And just like that, the legal battle I had dreaded was resolved. The emotional landscape, however, remained far more complicated. My mother stopped speaking, to me entirely. Tom limited his communication to terse texts about practical matters when absolutely necessary. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they were telling people I had manipulated Grandpa during his illness and stolen their inheritance. A narrative that bore no resemblance to reality, but clearly brought them comfort. Lisa, my unexpected ally throughout this ordeal, was outraged when I told her about these rumors. "That's absolutely disgusting," she fumed during one of her weekend visits. "Anyone who spent 10 minutes with you and Uncle Joe could see how genuine your relationship was. They're rewriting history to make themselves feel better." "It doesn't matter," I said, though of course it did. People who really knew Grandpa know the truth. Grandma Beth bore the family friction with characteristic grace. "Nancy will come around eventually," she predicted, though without much conviction. "She's stubborn, but she's not heartless. When the shock wears off, she'll remember you're her daughter." I wasn't so sure. The distance between my mother and me had been growing for decades, widening so gradually I had barely noticed until Grandpa's death forced me to see it clearly. Perhaps this rupture had been inevitable, the natural conclusion to years of emotional neglect and misaligned values. As spring arrived, bringing with it the first anniversary of Grandpa's diagnosis, I found myself increasingly drawn to the idea of visiting the cabin he had left me. I had the key and the location, a remote spot in Jefferson National Forest, about 3 hours' drive from home, but something had held me back from seeing it. Perhaps I hadn't been ready to confront such tangible evidence of how well Grandpa had known me, how specifically he had planned for my future, even as his own was ending. One clear Saturday in April, I finally made the journey. The directions Mr. Reeves had provided led me along increasingly narrow roads, eventually turning onto a gravel Forest Service track that wound through towering pines. After nearly a mile on this rough path, I reached a small clearing where a rustic wooden structure stood facing east toward a spectacular mountain view. The cabin was exactly as Mr. Reeves had described: one room, very basic, with a covered porch along the front. Built of weathered cedar with a metal roof, it looked both perfectly at home in its forest setting and somehow expectant, as if it had been waiting for my arrival. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the door. The interior was simple but thoughtfully arranged. A writing desk positioned before a large window to capture the view. A comfortable reading chair beside a small wood stove. A narrow bed built into the wall, a basic kitchenette in one corner. Bookshelves lined the walls, currently empty but ready to be filled. On the desk sat a manila envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Inside, I found the deed to the property, transfer paperwork already completed except for my signature, and a handwritten letter dated just weeks before his death. "Dear Sarah," it began, the script shakier than I remembered but still unmistakably his. "If you're reading this, you've finally visited your cabin. I hope it meets with your approval. I had Mike Townsend build it to my specifications, but I'm afraid I couldn't supervise the work as closely as I would have liked due to my health. The idea came to me after our conversation last Christmas, when you mentioned wanting just a quiet place to write without distractions. I remembered how Virginia Woolf wrote about a woman needing a room of one's own to create, and it struck me that perhaps what you needed was a cabin of your own, something more separate and defined than just a room. I've always believed, you have important things to say, Sarah, stories that need telling, perspectives worth sharing. But I've watched you put your writing aside again and again to care for others, for your students, for your grandmother, for me. This tendency toward selflessness is one of your finest qualities, but it shouldn't come at the expense of your own dreams. So consider this cabin your permission slip, your invitation to claim time and space for your own creative work. The world needs your voice, perhaps now more than ever in these fragmented, divisive times. There's no electricity, which was deliberate. Solar lanterns for evening light, a propane stove for coffee, a wood stove for chilly mornings. No internet, no television, no distractions. Just you, your thoughts, and that view that seems to extend forever. I won't be here to read what you write in this space, at least not in any conventional sense. But I like to think that somehow, somewhere, I'll know that you're finally giving yourself the gift of your own attention, your own priority. All my love. Always, Grandpa Joe. I sat at the desk for a long time after reading his letter, watching as the afternoon light shifted across the mountains, casting valleys into shadow while illuminating ridges in gold. The silent grandeur of the landscape seemed an appropriate backdrop for the emotions flowing through me. Grief and gratitude so intertwined, they formed a single complex feeling I couldn't name. Grandpa had created this space for me during his final months, when he must have been in considerable pain, when his energy was at its lowest. He had thought about what I needed, what would help me pursue the dream I had mentioned so fleetingly he might easily have forgotten it. Instead, he had transformed it into this tangible reality, this gift that asked nothing in return except that I value myself enough to use it. I opened my bag and took out the notebook I had brought, placing it on the desk and smoothing my hand over its blank pages. Then I began to write, hesitantly at first, then with increasing fluidity as the words found their rhythm. I wrote about Grandpa, about our bond that transcended conventional family roles. I wrote about what it means to be truly seen by another person. I wrote about grief and inheritance and the different currencies of love. The light faded as I wrote, but I barely noticed, lost in the flow of words, in the relief of finally giving shape to thoughts that had been swirling in my mind for months. When I finally looked up, stars were visible through the window, impossibly bright in the clear mountain sky, and I realized with surprise that I had been writing for hours. I lit one of the solar lanterns Grandpa had mentioned, its soft glow, creating a small circle of warmth in the darkness. There was a profound peace in this isolated place, a sense of being simultaneously removed from the world and more deeply connected to what mattered within it. I slept that night on the narrow bed, wrapped in a quilt I recognized from Grandma's linen closet, listening to the whispering of pines outside. In the morning, I made coffee on the small propane stove and took it onto the porch, watching the sun rise over the mountains, painting the landscape in shades of pink and gold. In that quiet moment, I felt Grandpa's presence more strongly than I had since his death, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as a continuation of the wisdom and love he had shared throughout my life. He had known what I needed before. I fully understood it myself. He had created this space where I could reconnect with my own voice, my own purpose. As I drove back to town later that day, I felt a clarity that had been missing in the turbulent months since Grandpa's death. The legal battles, the family tensions, the painful exclusions, they still mattered, still hurt, but they no longer defined my experience. What defined me now was the knowledge that I had been truly known, truly valued, by someone whose judgment I respected above all others. My mother and Tom might never understand or accept the choices Grandpa had made. They might continue to rewrite our family history to cast themselves as victims and me as manipulator, but their narrative couldn't change the truth I had lived. The thousands of hours at Grandpa's side, the conversations that ranged from philosophy to baseball, the shared silences that were as meaningful as any words. In the months that followed, I established a routine, teaching during the week, helping Grandma Beth on weekends, and spending one weekend each month at the cabin. I began work on what would eventually become a memoir about intergenerational relationships, about the unexpected ways we become family to each other, about how showing up consistently for someone can create bonds stronger than blood. Grandma, read my early drafts, offering gentle feedback and occasionally correcting my memory of events with her own perspective. Joe would be so proud, she told me after reading a particularly difficult chapter about his final days. Not just of the writing, though that's excellent, but of your honesty, your willingness to look at hard truths without flinching. By summer, when wildflowers bloomed in the clearing around the cabin, I had completed a substantial portion of the manuscript. The writing process had been therapeutic, helping me process my grief and make sense of the complex family dynamics that had shaped my life. But it was also something more, a fulfillment of potential Grandpa had seen in me long before I recognized it myself. One evening in late July, I returned from the cabin to find an unexpected visitor waiting on the porch of the family home. My mother, sitting stiffly in one of the wicker chairs, a manila envelope on her lap. "Sarah," she acknowledged as I approached, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope you don't mind my waiting. Beth said you'd be back soon." "It's fine," I replied, equally careful. "What brings you by?" She gestured to the envelope. "I found these while cleaning out some old files. Photos of you and Dad from when you were little. I thought you might want them." I sat in the chair opposite hers, maintaining a cautious distance. "Thank you." That was thoughtful. An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken grievances and unasked questions. Finally, my mother sighed, her composure cracking. slightly. "I saw your cabin last weekend," she said unexpectedly. I blinked in surprise. "My cabin? How?" "I was hiking with my friends from the hospital. We took that loop trail through Jefferson that passes near Miller Creek. I recognized the location from the property description in Dad's will." She paused, picking at an invisible thread on her sleeve. "It's exactly the kind of place he would choose. Isolated, contemplative, impractical." I waited, unsure where this was heading. "He built it for you while he was dying," she continued, an edge entering her voice. "He was in pain, losing weight, barely able to manage stairs, and he was designing a writing cabin for you." "I didn't ask him to," I said quietly. "I didn't even know about it until after he died." "I know." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "That's what makes it so. Dad. He was always thinking of ways to support your interests, your potential, even when it made no practical sense." There was something in her tone, not quite jealousy, not quite resentment, but adjacent to both, that revealed more about our relationship than any words could express. "He supported you too," I pointed out. "He helped with your nursing school tuition. He was proud when you became supervisor." "In practical ways, yes. But never like he did with you." She shook, her head slightly. "He never built me a cabin." The simplicity of the statement caught me off guard. Behind the legal battles and inheritance disputes lay this more fundamental grievance, a daughter who had never felt seen by her father the way her own daughter had been. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "I didn't create that dynamic." "No, you didn't." She sighed again, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I've been angry at the wrong person. It was easier to blame you than to accept that Dad and I never connected the way he did with you. That he saw something in you he didn't see, in me." This vulnerability from my mother, this admission of pain and insecurity, was unprecedented in our relationship. I didn't know how to respond, caught between empathy for her hurt and defense of the bond Grandpa and I had shared. "It wasn't about loving one person more than another," I said carefully. "It was about different kinds of connection, different ways of showing up for each other." "Perhaps." She stood, straightening her jacket in a gesture that signaled the end of this unexpected moment of openness. "Anyway, the photos are yours if you want them. I should get going." As she turned to leave, I found myself calling after her. "Mom, would you like to see what I'm writing? At the cabin?" She paused, looking back with genuine surprise. "You'd want me to read it?" "It's about Grandpa," I explained. "About family. About how complicated love can be between generations. It might help you understand things." For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Interest, perhaps, or the ghost of connection. But then her familiar reserve returned, walls rebuilding as I watched. "Maybe someday," she said, not unkindly, but without real commitment. "Right, now it's still too raw." I nodded, accepting this limit while recognizing the small opening it represented. Not reconciliation, not yet, but a hairline crack in the wall of silence between us. A possibility, however remote, of understanding. As I watched her drive away, I realized that Grandpa's final gift hadn't just been the cabin or the inheritance, or even the validation of our relationship. It had been the catalyst for this painful but necessary clarification of family dynamics, this peeling back of polite fictions to reveal the complex, sometimes wounding truths beneath. In his final recording, Grandpa had said something that resonated more deeply now. The greatest inheritance isn't material at all. It's the courage to see clearly and speak honestly. To recognize that genuine connection is rare and worthy of protection, even when that protection requires difficult choices. Standing on the porch of the house that had been his home for 60 years and was now partially mine, I felt the weight of that inheritance, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, a trust. To continue seeing clearly, to keep speaking honestly, to value authentic connection over comfortable pretense, and perhaps most importantly, to keep writing the story only I could tell, about a grandfather who showed me what unconditional love looks like and how that love continues to shape the person I am becoming, long after he himself is gone. 1. Year after Grandpa Joe's death, I stood in the backyard of what was now officially my home, watching as friends and family gathered for what we had decided to call a celebration of legacy rather than a memorial. Grandma Beth had been clear: no somber remembrances, no black clothing, no hushed voices thick with manufactured grief. Joe hated all that, she had insisted. He'd want stories and laughter and maybe a little whiskey. So that's what we created. Beneath the sprawling oak tree where Grandpa had built a treehouse for neighborhood children decades ago, we set up tables with photo albums, his favorite books, and small mementos that captured fragments of his life. I'd arranged his collection of peculiar rocks gathered from hiking trails, each labeled in his precise handwriting with location and date. Grandma contributed his ancient fishing lures, tarnished and worn, but preserved with care. Lisa brought the chess set he had used to teach her the game during summer visits when she was 12. People arrived bearing dishes and memories, exactly as Grandpa would have wanted. Former students, now middle-aged with students of their own. Neighbors whose yards he had helped tend when arthritis or illness made the work impossible for them. Friends from his hiking club, his Thursday night poker group, his volunteer literacy program at the local prison. What surprised me most was seeing my mother arrive, punctual as always, carrying a casserole and looking uncharacteristically uncertain. We had maintained a cautious, distant relationship since our porch conversation last summer. Occasional text messages, brief encounters at community events, one stilted coffee meeting where we had discussed everything except what mattered. Her presence today represented a step toward something neither of us could quite name yet. Tom had declined the invitation, citing a real estate conference in Phoenix. The excuse was plausible enough, though I suspected the real reason was his continued discomfort with how the inheritance had unfolded. Some wounds heal slowly, if at all. "Sarah, this is wonderful," Lisa said, joining me beneath the oak tree. Uncle Joe would have loved every bit of it. "Except maybe the part where people say nice things about him," I replied with a small smile. "He always got embarrassed by compliments." "True," she laughed. "He'd be telling everyone to stop making such a fuss and go enjoy the food instead." I watched as Grandma Beth moved through the gathering with quiet grace, accepting condolences that had somehow maintained their sincerity even a year later. At 85, she had adapted to widowhood with the same practical resilience she brought to everything. She had joined a senior art class, volunteered at the library's genealogy department, and even started taking weekend drives with her friend Eleanor, who, at 82, still insisted on driving her immaculately maintained 1989 Buick. "You should say something," Lisa nudged gently. "People would appreciate hearing from you." I nodded, though public speaking had never been my favorite activity. I had prepared remarks, knowing this moment would come, but the reality of addressing this gathering, these people who had loved Grandpa in their own distinct ways, felt suddenly daunting. As if sensing my hesitation, Grandma Beth approached and took my hand. "It's time, dear. They're waiting." With her steadying presence beside me, I moved to the center of the gathering. Conversations quieted naturally as people noticed us, turning with expectant faces that held only warmth and shared remembrance. "Thank you all for coming today," I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. Grandpa Joe, or Professor Wilson, or Joe, or Mr. W, depending on how you knew him, would have been both embarrassed and deeply moved by this turnout. Appreciative chuckles rippled through the crowd. For those who might be expecting a formal speech, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. Grandpa believed that the best way to honor someone's memory wasn't through carefully crafted eulogies, but through living out the values they embodied. So instead of telling you who he was, which you already know from your own connections with him, I'd like to share what he taught me and how I'm trying to carry that forward. I glanced at my mother, who stood slightly apart from the others, her expression a complex mixture of grief and something that might have been pride. Grandpa taught me that showing up is the most fundamental act of love, not just for special occasions or emergencies, but consistently, reliably, day after ordinary day. He showed up for his students, his neighbors, his friends, his family, not when it was convenient or comfortable, but when it mattered, especially then. Several heads nodded in recognition. He taught me that listening, really listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak, is a form of respect so profound it can transform relationships. How many of you, I asked, looking around the gathering, felt that when you spoke to Joe Wilson, you had his complete, undivided attention? Nearly every hand raised, confirming what I had always known. Grandpa's capacity for presence hadn't been reserved just for me, but was a gift he had offered widely. He taught me that knowledge without kindness is worthless, that integrity matters more than achievement, and that a life well lived isn't measured by acquisitions but by connections. I paused, feeling the weight of the next words. And in his final year, as his body failed him but his mind remained sharp and observant, he taught me about dying with dignity and purpose, about using the time we have, however limited, to set things right, to speak necessary truths, to create lasting good. Glancing toward the house that had been his home for 60 years, I continued. Many of you know that Grandpa made some decisions about his estate that created challenges within our family. What you may not know is that those decisions weren't made lightly or without careful consideration. They reflected his deeply held belief that inheritance isn't just about property or money. It's about values, legacy, recognition of care. My mother shifted uncomfortably but made no move to leave. In the year since his death, I've come to understand that his greatest gift wasn't the material provisions of his will, but the example he set of living according to principle, even when that's difficult, even when it creates conflict, even when it would be easier to follow convention than conviction. The gathering had grown deeply quiet, attentive in a way that reminded me of how students would listen when Grandpa spoke, not out of obligation, but genuine interest. So as we remember Joe Wilson today, I invite each of you to consider what you inherited from him that can't be listed in a legal document or assigned a monetary value. What wisdom, what example, what challenge to conventional thinking did he leave with you? And how might you honor that through how you live? I raised the small glass of whiskey Grandma had insisted we provide for toasts. To Grandpa Joe, professor, mentor, friend, and the best example I've ever known of what it means to live with integrity and die with grace. To Joe, echoed through the gathering as glasses were raised in a final salute. As people returned to conversations and reminiscences, my mother approached hesitantly, her own glass still full. "That was well said," she offered, her tone carefully neutral. "Dad would have appreciated the lack of sentimentality." "Thank you," I replied, equally careful. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, both acutely aware of the distance between us, yet somehow less comfortable with it than we had been previously. "I've been reading your book," she said abruptly. I stared at her in surprise. "My book? How did you—" "Beth gave me the manuscript," she explained. "She thought I should see it before it was published. Said it might help me understand certain things." The revelation left me momentarily speechless. The memoir I had been writing at the cabin was deeply personal, unsparing in its portrayal of family dynamics, including my complicated relationship with my mother. I had shared it with Grandma Beth for her perspective, but hadn't considered that she might pass it along without consulting me. "I see," I managed finally. "And?" She glanced around at the gathering, clearly uncomfortable having this conversation in such a public setting. "It's not what I expected," she admitted. "I thought it would be accusatory, a chance to settle scores, but it's more nuanced than that, more fair." "I tried to be honest without being vindictive," I said. "It wasn't always easy." "No, I imagine not." She twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. "Your portrayal of me is painful to read, but not inaccurate. That's a difficult combination to face. This admission, this acknowledgement of even partial truth in my perspective, was unprecedented. I didn't quite know how to respond. "I'm still processing it," she continued when I didn't speak. "Some parts make me defensive or angry. Others make me question memories I thought were reliable. It's disorienting to see yourself through someone else's eyes, especially when that version contradicts the story you've told yourself." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The memoir writing process had forced me to reconsider my own narratives, to question whether I had been entirely fair in my assessments, to confront my own contributions to family friction. "Would you be willing to talk with me about it?" she asked, her voice dropping to ensure privacy. "Not today, obviously, but sometime, before it's published. There are things I'd like to explain, not to change your account, but to add context you might not have had." The request was reasonable, even generous given the unflattering portrayal she had encountered in my pages. Yet I hesitated, wary of reopening wounds that had just begun to heal, of subjecting my truth to potential revision or doubt. "I would," I said finally, "but I can't promise to change anything based on those conversations. The book is my experience, my perspective. It's not meant to be the definitive family history." "I understand," she nodded. "I'm not asking for editorial control. Just conversation. A chance to be heard, the way you've been heard through your writing." Something in her phrasing struck me. The recognition that writing had given me a voice she acknowledged had been previously unheard or dismissed. It represented a shift, however small, in our fundamentally imbalanced relationship. "We could meet at the cabin," I suggested spontaneously. "Next weekend, if you're free. It's a good place for difficult conversations." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "The cabin? You'd want me there?" "Grandpa built it for truth-telling," I said simply. "This seems like an appropriate use." Before she could respond, Grandma Beth joined us, slipping her arm through my mother's, with natural ease. "What are you two conspiring about so seriously? This is supposed to be a celebration." "Sarah has invited me to see her cabin next weekend," my mother explained, her tone suggesting she was still processing the invitation. Herself. Grandma's face brightened. "Oh, that's wonderful. It's such a special place. Joe would be pleased to know you're both spending time there." Her assumption that we would find healing in that space Grandpa had created was touching, if perhaps optimistic. Some divides are too wide to cross completely. Some hurts too deep to fully mend. Yet the possibility of understanding, if not reconciliation, now seemed less remote than it had a year ago. The rest of the gathering passed in a blur of conversations, shared memories, and the peculiar mixture of grief and celebration that marks the best commemorations of a life well lived. As dusk fell, lights strung through the oak tree's branches illuminated the remaining guests, creating a warm glow that seemed to hold the darkness at bay. My mother left shortly after dark, pausing on her way out to confirm our cabin meeting, with surprising commitment. Tom called later that evening, ostensibly to check how the event had gone, but clearly fishing for information about the will's implementation and whether any further legal challenges might be possible. I kept my responses brief and factual, recognizing that his journey toward acceptance, if it came at all, would follow a different timeline than my mother's. After the last guests departed and Grandma Beth had gone to bed, I sat alone on the yussy back porch, listening to the night sounds that had formed the soundtrack of my childhood. Cicadas pulsing in rhythm, distant train whistles marking the hours, wind rustling through oak leaves in a whisper, just like Grandpa's voice when he'd read me to sleep. The memoir manuscript lay on my lap, dog-eared and notation-filled from my mother's reading. Her willingness to engage with it, to face her portrayal in my unfiltered recollections, had surprised me nearly as much as her appearance at today's gathering. Perhaps Grandma was right. Perhaps there was still space for evolution in our relationship, even after decades of misunderstanding and mutual disappointment. I opened the manuscript to a passage I had struggled to write, a scene from my early adolescence when I had won a prestigious writing contest, only to have my mother respond with distracted congratulations before turning the conversation to Tom's college applications. In the margin beside this painful memory, my mother had written a single word: sorry. Not an explanation or justification, not a denial or counter-narrative, just acknowledgement of hurt caused and regret for it. Small, but significant. The following Saturday, I arrived at the cabin early to prepare for my mother's visit. I built a small fire in the wood stove to counter the autumn chill, arranged 2 chairs on the porch facing the mountain view, and made coffee in the battered percolator Grandpa had left as part of the cabin's sparse furnishings. When her car appeared on the forest track, moving cautiously over the uneven surface, I felt a surge of anxiety unlike anything I'd experienced in this peaceful place before. Our relationship had existed in a kind of suspended animation since Grandpa's death, neither fully broken nor genuinely repaired, characterized more by avoidance than active conflict. Today would change that, for better or worse. She emerged from her car looking uncharacteristically casual in jeans and a sweater rather than her usual tailored slacks and blouse. The setting seemed to demand this concession to informality, this stepping outside established patterns. "This is quite a drive," she observed, surveying the clearing and cabin with undisguised curiosity. "I'm not sure my suspension will ever recover." Grandpa thought the difficulty accessing it was a feature, not a bug, I replied, smiling slightly. He said true sanctuary requires effort. "That sounds like Dad," she acknowledged, following me onto the porch where coffee and the view awaited, always finding profound meaning in practical inconveniences. We settled into the cedar chairs, accepting the strange intimacy created by this isolated setting, this shared connection to the man who had created it. For several minutes, we simply drank our coffee and absorbed the panorama of mountains rolling toward the horizon, mist still clinging to distant valleys, though the morning was well advanced. "I can see why you write here," my mother said finally. "It feels removed from everything. Ordinary." That was Grandpa's intention, I agreed. He wanted me to have a place apart from daily obligations and distractions, somewhere I could focus on writing without feeling selfish for taking the time. She nodded slowly. "He always did understand what you needed, often before you knew yourself." There was that note again, not quite resentment, not quite admiration, but some complex emotion braided from both. I decided to address it directly rather than talking around it as we had for decades. "It bothers you, doesn't it? The connection Grandpa and I had." She considered this, her gaze still fixed on the distant mountains. "Yes," she admitted finally. "Though not in the way you might think. I wasn't jealous exactly. More mystified. I never understood how it formed or why I couldn't seem to create something similar with either of you." The honesty was startling after years of careful avoidance and polite pretense. I sensed that the setting, this place so removed from our usual contexts and associations, was allowing a different kind of conversation than had previously been possible. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious. She sighed, setting her coffee mug on the small table between us. "You and Dad had this immediate understanding. this natural affinity that seemed to require no effort. You liked the same books, laughed at the same obscure jokes, could sit in comfortable silence for hours. With me, every interaction felt more deliberate, more work. I had never considered our family dynamics from this perspective. My mother as the outsider looking in on a connection she couldn't access, rather than the authority figure deliberately excluding me from her attention. When you were little, she continued, you would light up when Dad entered a room, not just normal childish excitement, but this profound recognition, as if you'd found your person. I used to wonder if there was something wrong with me, that my own daughter preferred my father's company so consistently. It wasn't a competition, I said softly. Loving him didn't mean loving you less. Intellectually, I knew that, she acknowledged. But emotionally, it felt like constant confirmation that I was somehow deficient, not engaging enough, not attentive in the right ways, not whatever it was that created that spark between you and Dad. I tried to imagine how that must have felt, watching her daughter form a deep bond with her father that mirrored or perhaps exceeded the connection he'd had with her. The insecurity it might have generated, the sense of being somehow supplanted in her own family narrative. When did you realize you were writing? She asked, changing direction slightly. About 2 years ago, I replied, just before Grandpa got sick. It started as essays about teaching, but evolved into something more personal. And you told Dad about it? Not really, I admitted. I mentioned wanting a quiet place to write during a conversation about Virginia Woolf. I didn't expect him to remember it, much less act on it. She smiled faintly. That was Dad, listening between the lines, catching the wishes people didn't quite speak aloud. He built me a dollhouse when I was 9 because I'd pointed one out in a store window months earlier. Not for my birthday or Christmas, just because he remembered I had wanted it. This glimpse of my mother's childhood, of Grandpa's attention to her unspoken desires, created an unexpected bridge between our experiences. Perhaps the connection I had thought unique to our relationship had been present in hers as well, at least in her early years. What changed? I asked. Between you and Grandpa, I mean. She considered this, her expression thoughtful. Life, I suppose. College, career, marriage. The distance that naturally forms as you build your own life separate from your parents. And then, when your father left us, I was so focused on survival, on working enough hours to support us, on maintaining some semblance of normalcy for you. Kids, that deeper connections became luxury items I couldn't afford. But you maintained that connection with Tom, I pointed out, trying to keep my tone neutral rather than accusatory. Tom was easier, she said after a moment. Less complicated. Less observant. He needed practical things I could provide, help with homework, rides to sports, later advice about college and careers. Straightforward needs with clear solutions. And I needed understanding, recognition, emotional presence. Things that required time and energy I simply didn't have, especially after working 12-hour nursing shifts dealing with other people's emotional crises. Her explanation made a certain logical sense, though it couldn't entirely heal the hurt of those years spent seeking attention that went primarily to my brother. Still, there was something validating about having my perception acknowledged rather than dismissed or denied. I should have managed it better, she continued unexpectedly. Found ways to connect with both of you, not just the easier path. Dad tried to tell me, actually, several times over the years. But I was defensive, convinced I was doing the best I could under difficult circumstances. You were, I said, surprised to find I meant it. Maybe not perfect, but who is? You kept us housed, fed, educated. That counts for something. She smiled sadly. Baseline parenting isn't quite the aspiration, though, is it? Not something to celebrate. Meeting minimum requirements while missing the deeper connections. We fell silent again, each absorbed in our own thoughts as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist and illuminating the landscape in crisp autumn clarity. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace. "I've been thinking about your book," my mother said eventually, "about how to respond to it beyond just our conversation today." "Oh?" I prompted when she didn't immediately continue. "I'd like to write something, not a rebuttal exactly, but a companion perspective. My experience of the same events, the same relationships, not to contradict your account but to complement it, to create a more complete picture." The suggestion was unexpected but intriguing. "Like a dialogue across texts?" "Exactly," she nodded, animation entering her expression for the first time. "Both perspectives valid even when they differ. Both partial, limited by individual perception and position. Together, perhaps, approaching something closer to the complex reality of family." I considered what this might mean. Not just for the memoir itself, which could certainly be enriched by such an approach, but for our relationship. The willingness to engage with difficult truths rather than avoiding them. The acknowledgement that multiple perspectives could coexist without one invalidating the other. "I like that idea," I said finally. "It feels honest in a way that either narrative alone wouldn't be." Relief crossed her features, as if she had expected rejection rather than acceptance. "I'd need some time. And I'm not a writer by training. So the quality wouldn't match yours." "Quality isn't the point," I assured her. "Authenticity is." She nodded, seeming to draw confidence from my response. "When does your publisher need the final manuscript?" 3 months, I replied. "Think that's enough time?" "It will have to be," she said with unexpected determination. "Some stories have waited too long already to be told." As the day progressed, we talked more specifically about the memoir, about scenes my mother remembered differently, context she felt was missing, perspectives that might complement my account. The conversation wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension when our versions diverged significantly, instances where pain from the past flared into present discomfort. But beneath these difficulties ran a current of something I hadn't expected: mutual respect. For the first time in my adult life, I felt my mother was truly listening to me, considering my perspective without immediately dismissing or minimizing it. And I, in turn, found myself more open to her account than I had anticipated, more willing to recognize the complexity of her position as a single mother, trying to rebuild a life while raising 2 children. When evening approached, bringing with it a chill that even the small wood stove couldn't entirely dispel, we reluctantly prepared to leave the cabin and return to our regular lives. Standing on the porch for a final look at the mountains now, shadowed with approaching night, my mother surprised me by asking a question she had never posed before. "Are you happy, Sarah? With your life as it is now?" The simplicity of the question belied its depth. I considered it carefully, wanting to give an honest answer. "Mostly," I said finally. "I love teaching, and the writing fulfills something essential in me. Having this place," I gestured toward the cabin and surrounding forest, "has been transformative. And redefining my relationship with you and Tom, however painful that process has been, feels necessary and ultimately positive." I paused, aware of what I hadn't mentioned. But there's loneliness too. Questions about paths not taken. Wondering sometimes if focusing so much on family connections has come at the expense of romantic ones. She nodded, accepting this complex answer without trying to simplify or solve it. Life is always a series of trade-offs, isn't it? Choices that open some doors while closing others. Grandpa used to say something similar, I recalled. Every yes contains 1,000 implicit no's. The art of living well is choosing your yeses. Carefully. That sounds like Dad, she agreed with a small smile. Always finding the profound in the obvious. As we locked the cabin and walked toward our cars, a sense of completion settled over me, not in the sense that our relationship was fully healed or all conflicts resolved, but that a necessary conversation had finally begun after decades of avoidance and misunderstanding. The distance between us remained, but it felt less like an unbridgeable chasm and more like a space where new possibilities might eventually grow. My mother paused before getting into her car. "Thank you for showing me this place, for letting me into this part of your life with Dad." "Thank you for being willing to see it," I replied simply. We drove away separately, following the rough forest track back to the main road where our paths would diverge. She toward her apartment in the city, I toward the family home I now shared with Grandma Beth. But something had shifted between us, some first tender growth emerging from soil I had thought permanently barren. 3 months later, my publisher received not one manuscript but 2, my memoir and my mother's response, bound together under the title Parallel Lines, A Daughter and Mother Remember. The editor's initial skepticism gave way to genuine excitement, as she recognized the unique perspective this dual narrative offered on family dynamics, inheritance both material and emotional, and the possibility of evolution in even the most entrenched relationships. Tom declined to contribute his own perspective, maintaining his distance from both the family reconciliation and the literary project. Some wounds heal more slowly than others. Some never heal at all. I had come to accept this as another of life's imperfect resolutions, neither wholly satisfying nor completely disappointing. On the anniversary of the day, Grandpa Joe had shown me how to skip stones across the lake near our house, a memory that formed the opening scene of my memoir. I returned to the cabin alone. The manuscript was complete, the publication process underway, the most essential truths spoken and acknowledged if not entirely resolved. I sat at the desk he had positioned to capture the perfect view, feeling his presence not as a ghost, but as an ongoing influence, a voice that continued to guide and challenge long after its physical source had vanished. The words he had written, in his final letter to me, echoed with renewed meaning. Some bonds transcend death. Some truths matter more than comfort. Some legacies can't be measured in dollars or square footage. Opening my notebook to a blank page, I began to write again. Not about the past this time, but about the future. About possibilities. About the complex inheritance of understanding that sometimes emerges from loss. About how endings often contain within them the seeds of unexpected beginnings. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past the window in a gentle cascade of red and gold, each one a small, perfect letting go. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.